Hi. To continue our examination of Confucianism, we're going to look at the notion of virtue and the very specific virtues that Confucius emphasized. So I think it's helpful here to look at a couple different competing conceptions of virtue. These are the Greek conception, the Latin conception, and the Chinese conception. So for the Greeks, virtue is the term arete, and that means something like excellence, to perform excellently or do something excellently. And generally, for the Greek conception, something is excellent when it performs its function well. And now to the Latin conception, this is where we get the term virtue in English. We just adopted the Latin term and then made it an English word. And so originally there's the word vir, which means man. And so then people started talking about virtue, something pertaining to a man, something manly, in other words. And so the idea here became much more broad because then the basic focus is on a man as something powerful in a sense. And so virtue is sort of what is powerful in a thing. And so you'll find a lot of older text in English that will talk about, the virtues of, some sort of chemical. And that might just be, what kind of powers does it have to dissolve something or what have you. So it's just this notion of power is kind of the main one for the term virtue deriving from that Latin tradition. Now to the Chinese conception, it's kind of similar to the Latin one. So there's this verb that it's linked to, which means to get. And so we can understand getting something. You might have a good ability to do that and have this power at getting various things. And so originally in some of the Chinese texts, ancient Chinese texts that we have, the term virtue was often applied to rulers, or maybe even exclusively applied to rulers who received this power from heaven to have an influence over the people they're ruling over, and so to get their subjects to do certain things, to obey, the various laws and so on. The term gets broader, though, and so you talk about power or virtue of people that aren't rulers. But this term still retains the notion of having a power over others. But it must be emphasized that this power over others is a moral power over others. So it's not that you're deceiving others, forcing others to do what they don't want in some immoral way, but it's always kind of a moral power. So you might think of moral charisma here. Martin Luther King Jr., for example, inspiring others to do morally good things, well, that's a power that he had over others. So with that look at the notion of virtue, we can now turn to the specific virtues emphasized by Confucianism. So many different virtues are mentioned or emphasized in the Analects, and then likewise in the Confucian tradition. But we can single out four in particular as what we can call cardinal virtues, and this list is really what comes from Mencius, not Confucius himself. So there's these four primary, most important virtues that you can translate as humaneness or goodness or benevolence. That's the first one. It's hard to translate what that is. Then there's rightness, or sometimes translated righteousness. Then there's ritual propriety, so the virtue of performing rituals, having a disposition to perform rituals, doing those rituals well, correctly. And then there's wisdom. So we'll talk about each of those four in the rest of this lecture. But I want to emphasize that there are many others mentioned in the Analects, such as trustworthiness, courage, dutifulness, filial piety. So the last one, filial piety, being having a devotion and acting correctly to your parents. So that's really where that emphasis on family comes in. So what we'll now do is look at the four cardinal virtues and see what those amount to. So the first virtue to focus on is ren, which can be translated in a bunch of different ways: goodness, humaneness, benevolence. Each of these, I think, emphasizes some aspects of the term and, leaves others out. Goodness is the most broad, so it probably does include all of the aspects of the term, but it's also just good is such a broad term in English that doesn't really get so specific as the Chinese term is. And so this is one where it's actually helpful to look at the Chinese character. It's actually composed of two other Chinese characters. So there's person. So I've provided these on the slide. So there's the character for person, which kind of looks like this tent sort of thing. And then there's the character for two, which appropriately enough is two lines. And so then you mash those together, you put those together, you get the term ren, or goodness. So with this etymology, we might define or characterize goodness as a disposition for appreciating others' common humanity and acting in ways that promote that common humanity. So one philosopher, Herb Vinaigrette, says that, quote, for Confucius, unless there are at least two human beings, there can be no human beings. What he's emphasizing is that human beings are social animals, that you cannot just have one isolated human being exist, at least in principle. So now the question is, what does it take to have this virtue? What are you supposed to do if you have this virtue? And really, it's acting appropriately with respect to others. And so one way to think about this is from Analects 15.24, which expresses what's come to be known as the Confucian golden rule. And so it has a slight different emphasis than what you might think of as the Christian golden rule. So on the Confucian golden rule, quote, do not impose upon others what you yourself do not desire. Notice the negatives there, do not and do not desire. So if you don't want something to happen to you, don't impose it on others, don't do it to others. So that's one thing entailed by this virtue of goodness or humaneness. But so far that's just negative. It says don't do certain things to other people. There's also this connotation of benevolence. So in Analects 12.22, Confucius says care for others. So doing good things for others is part of what's going to be involved in having this virtue. We should emphasize here that it's not just good actions, actions that help others, that's required to be virtuous or have this virtue. It's not merely the external appearance of caring for others, doing good things for others that matters. It's actually being good. So Confucius says that, quote, a clever tongue and fine appearance are rarely signs of goodness. So recognizing this distinction between merely appearing to be good and actually internally having the virtue of goodness helps us to transition to the next virtue, rightness. So rightness we might characterize as the internalization of the proper order of values. So by internalization, I mean something like having the right motives, having the right feelings, having the right thoughts, in addition to performing the right sorts of actions. We saw how that was important in having goodness, and we'll say more about that in a bit. In addition to internalizing correct thoughts and feelings and motives, rightness also requires that you have some sense internally of the proper ordering of what is to be valued. And this is indicated in a couple different passages. So in Analects 4.16, there's the emphasis that the gentleman, this exemplary person, has an understanding of rightness, and then what helps us is really the contrast, whereas the petty person, the person kind of concerned with just external things, understands profit. And so the gentleman's going to recognize some importance for profit, but they're not going to give too much weight to it. It's not ultimately what's valuable. Likewise, the gentleman seeks it in himself, whereas the petty person seeks it in others. So the gentleman has the appropriate understanding of what is valuable as being internal. It's not just internalizing it, but actually have an understanding of the importance of internalization. Another passage that's too long to put on the slide here is Analects 17.23, whereas where it said that the gentleman admires rightness above all. And then what's helpful here is that it goes on and says, a gentleman who possessed courage but lacked a sense of rightness. So notice it's actually a gentleman that just doesn't have rightness but has other virtues, would create political disorder. And so basically disorder is kind of the opposite of rightness, is what I'm suggesting. So the last passage I've put on the slide indicates how you acquire this virtue of rightness. So it says, quote, the gentleman takes rightness as a substance, puts it into practice by means of ritual, and so on. So this passage emphasizes that rightness can be this basis for putting into practice good action. But we'll see also that ritual is also how you develop this virtue of rightness or righteousness. And so this leads us to the virtue of ritual propriety. And we can characterize this as the performance of rituals, not merely just this external concern, but the performance of rituals with an awareness and appreciation of the function and value of the ritual. And so there's this internal element to having ritual propriety as well. A few other things are worth saying about ritual, or emphasizing that ritual is a broad category, not just religious practices, but also etiquette and various norms. What Confucius emphasizes is doing rituals with an awareness and understanding of their value, psychologically, or value for promoting social goals, social cohesion, for example. And so part of ritual propriety is engaging in reflection, to focus on that, to have this awareness of the goal of the ritual. Sometimes Confucius is sort of caricatured with the passage where it said, quote, he would not sit unless his mat was straight. You might think, well, having your mat be straight that you're sitting on, or having your chair just so perfectly positioned, well, that doesn't matter so much for becoming a morally exemplary person. But the emphasis, I think, of that passage is a little misleading because it ignores all the internal stuff. So we look at another passage, 3.12, where Confucius says, if I am not fully present at the sacrifice, it is as if I did not sacrifice at all. And so it could be doing all the externally correct things at the sacrifice, but not having the right internal awareness of what's going on, of the value of the ritual. So in addition to emphasizing how ritual needs to have this internal component, it's also worth noting that there is a bit of flexibility here with ritual. And so Analects 3.4 says, quote, when it comes to ritual, it is better to be spare than extravagant. And so you need to not just do what has been traditionally done, but think about what you're doing, think about what purpose it's going to serve. So you might now ask, how is it that we're supposed to correctly carry out these rituals and maybe be more spare than extravagant? Or, how are we supposed to figure out how to adopt an ancient ritual and apply it to today? And this is really where the last virtue comes in, wisdom. Now, wisdom we might characterize as the acquisition of traditional knowledge with an ability to reflect on that knowledge. So not just accepting, what the sages said, but also thinking it through, reflecting on it. And you're doing this in order to make practical deliberations about what to do in particular circumstances. So the idea there is that the wise person can make something like reliably good judgments about what to do in various situations, on the basis of the knowledge that they've acquired from sages. We can look at a few passages. Confucius makes a very Socratic point that wisdom requires that you recognize what you do not know is what you do not know. But there's other passages that are helpful. So another one is that the wise are not confused. It's very pithy, very, seems unhelpful. But if we think about what it means to be confused, that's helpful. So being confused literally means two things fused together. If a wise person is not fused together. That is to say, their thoughts are not kind of just jumbled up. And so when they face a particular situation, they can make good distinctions about the relevant features of the situation. So they might come across a situation where, some ancient sage had done something, but the new situation might be somewhat different than the old one. So the wise person can distinguish the difference there, the relevant differences, and make an appropriate judgment about what to do. Finally, I think wisdom also involves balancing different values and being very sensitive to context. There's many passages where Confucius is emphasized as doing one thing, and in another passage it seems like he's doing the complete opposite. And we see this in Annex 10.1, where in one context he's kind of, doesn't really say anything, seems like he doesn't have anything to say. Other contexts he can speak eloquently. It's coming from his wisdom in being able to see what's appropriate to the context and balancing various values that might be at stake. So this gives us a good transition to our final lecture on Confucianism, where we look at a few particular cases and how to think through them from a Confucian perspective.